Okay, dear beloveds, I've swapped internet sources and I am back. My apologies. Thank you for those of you who joined me. I hope you find me again. I was just explaining that I am going out this evening to celebrate some of the really beautiful things that have been happening in the Institute in the last few weeks. Hence the reason I'm a little bit more dressed up this time. On a Friday evening would normally be heading to bed time, but instead I am hanging out with you, and then I am going out with my man and celebrating some of the beautiful the beautiful big up-levelings in the Institute and taking some time to celebrate, which is something that is vital to our success as entrepreneurs on the path, that we take some time and we pause and we reflect and we rejoice for all that we're doing, because our service is our medicine, which means that we're not just doing a job, we are constantly moving our soul closer to God. And that's my purpose, and that's all of our purposes. So it can be very challenging if we don't nourish ourselves deeply enough. So tonight, that is celebration for me. So hence the reason I have washed my hair. I'm a little bit more dressed up than usual when I do my mini masterclasses. But I think I'm back, and I hope you can all hear me properly. You can let me know if you're watching and the sound's good and the picture's good, and I'll jump into it. I loved your message, Beck, and thank you for sharing that, the synchronicities of grace being something that we were both kind of meeting and talking and thinking about. And I wanted to talk about the idea of the state of grace as part of the formula for the sacred leader that I have been sharing for some time now, and it's the second phase of that formula. What grace means to me is that unending, uninterrupted connection with our experience of ourselves as God. So grace is what God feels like, or the goddess feels like, when we have an embodied experience, not just a kind of, oh yes, this is, I'm now going to sit with God in meditation because that's what I know I should do. But when actually you move beyond the mind and you move into an embodied experience of knowing yourself as the divine. And that is what I consider to be a state of grace. And these moments are enough to keep us moving forwards, even when we have weeks and months of sitting down to do our devotion and we don't kind of get into that heightened state. These precious moments keep us motivated on the path of our awakening, because they are so, pleasurable and joyful, and such a recognition, sorry, I'm molting, of what we truly are. So grace is by my definition, that experience of ourself beyond the limits of the thinking mind, beyond the ego-identified form, where we merge with that true essence, or that true energy of what we are, which is constantly and always with us. But our ego-identified self is like a barrier that separates us from that truth. So you can imagine the ego-identified self, or the personality, as that part of us that is actually a prison of our own making. So the less we believe about ourselves, the less we identify with the level of form, the freer we are to embody or experience an embodied experience of God or grace. There being the same thing, grace being that experience, if you like, the verb, God's the noun and grace is the verb. That is a state of being that only comes from letting go, and surrender and trust are its precursors. Now, surrender and trust are pretty big ideas in our spiritual world. We know these are things that we have to get good at. We know sometimes we're working blind with these ideas. We're like, what am I surrendering into? Who am I trusting? These ideas can feel very innocuous and just sort of beyond our capacity to really understand. But I'm going to give you a way into understanding that, and a way into grace, which I think is going to help. So what do I consider to be the opposite of grace? The opposite of grace to me is control. And you can think about this as false control, because it is only ever an illusion that we are the ones that are in control of anything. If we look at our lives, we know that in a heartbeat, what we thought was certain can change. And that can become a cause for celebration, or at least for deep rest or peace, because no longer are we trying to control the outcome. The false control, however, can't make any space or peace for the grace that comes when we surrender to the divine plan. False control is where we try to play God or enact God by forcing an outcome. We believe from our limited human self that we know what's best in a scenario. We know how things should have turned out. And as a result, we sit in a space where we're trying to play God for everybody and everything else around us. We might not leave a relationship that we should have left, or we might stay in a job we don't like, or we might, parent in a particular way because we do not trust God. And therefore we're trying to be God's proxy by managing everybody around us, including ourselves. This false control is really a state of imprisonment. Sorry, I need to cross my legs even though I'm not in my stretchy pants. Oh, I need fancy stretchy pants. If there's such a thing, please let me know. So when we're in a state of grace, we're in a state of surrender to God's will or divine will. We feel inspiration enter into us and we take action fearlessly, or at least being willing to meet our fear, because we know that we're being guided and we don't have to be afraid of the outcome, even though we do not know where their path is going to lead us. When we're in control, when we're in that state of false control, we will try to change things, do things, or force things to move out of that space of feeling out of control. We are no longer comfortable with surrender. We may have gone into surrender and got to a certain place. And this is the interesting thing about this, is this idea of false control and trying to usurp God is something that often happens when we're quite far along the spiritual path, because our saboteur, our sneaky saboteur archetype, our shadow, has to get clever and more clever as to how it can derail us from going towards God, which is ultimately what the ego doesn't want you to do, because if you do that, then you put it out of a job. The ego is just trying to protect you. The ego isn't a malevolent creature. The ego just simply thinks that what is best for it is best for you, and of course we know better than that. So when we feel out of control, we will attempt to change something in our reality in order to have a feeling of control and to feel as though that is divine guidance. So how do we know the difference between true divine inspiration and just messing about with our ordinary waking reality because we're terrified of that feeling of being out of control? Well, the difference is love or fear, of course, but the way to recognize them can only come from a deep devotion and turning up to our practices every damn day. The way that false control can work is that we are, say, in a relationship and it's going really well and everything's good, and then suddenly we decide it has to end, because in order to assert some sense of control, we have to change something around us, even if there wasn't any particular reason to change it or good reasons not to change it. So we become this sort of, I guess if you like, we will then look for, or will try to make reasons as to why we had to do that. Oh, this was in the best interest of my evolution. I just wasn't getting what I need, or whatever the story might be. We'll end something. We'll change things unnecessarily. We'll jump from one thing to the next in order to try to assert or reassert that sense of authority, even though we've moved so far towards surrendering to God. And this is really why I want to kind of share this with you today, because when we make our way on our spiritual path, on that path of awakening, we might hope that we're only going to be tested once, that we're only going to experience some, challenges once or twice, and then everything's just going to be skipping through the wildflowers back to God. And yes, that's true, but there's also going to be this up-leveling of the way, as I said, the shadow needs to get sneakier and sneakier in order to keep you away from God. It has to get more and more clever and seemingly logical. This is a strategy that I've seen used a lot to keep women, the women who I train, away from their power. So they'll leave things prematurely, or they'll cause emotional chaos where there didn't need to be any, or they'll throw the cat among the pigeons when everything was actually working really well. And it looks like, oh, well, this was divine guidance, but actually it is this false control. It's this attempt to assert authority because the path before us is uncertain and we've become unable to manage that feeling of uncertainty. So we move things around. We call this moving furniture in a burning building, because in fact all we're doing is creating more emotional chaos at the level of the dream in order to avoid meeting ourselves. So the opposite of grace is control. And the only way we can know the difference between divine inspiration and this false control is devotion, turning up to our practices again and again and again with consistency, to sit with God and to be in that state of grace, which is not going to come to you every single time you meditate, but it will become more and more frequent. And when you've had an experience of that grace, you come to recognize that almost nothing outside of you ever needs to change in order for you to receive it. The other side, as I mentioned, that opposite of false control, that grace, is that whatever happens, you see as a miracle. Whatever is placed in front of you, you're willing to accept and surrender to with absolute love and gratitude. You're not running around like a headless chicken, constantly changing things, constantly committing to something and then changing your mind and then doing this and going back on it, or leaving this relationship, or walking over here, or leaving, moving states, or buying a house, or selling a house, or whatever it is. The constant sense of I have a purposeful life because I'm always busy at the level of the dream is the absolute epitome of false control. So I'm sharing this with you today in case I can possibly help you, skip through a few steps of having to try and move furniture in a burning building to try and change things at the level of the dream, when in truth the only place that we are altering anything ever is within, at that level of perception. So the perception of my reality is what determines whether it is grace infused or control infused and chaotic. I would love to hear if you have an experience of this yourself, if you've noticed in yourself the times where you move out of trust and you move into false control, remembering that this is a constant movement that we must become vigilant of, and that we can course correct really quickly. When we don't notice it for a long time or even a few days, we can actually end up causing lots and lots of chaos. And the quicker that we notice that we've moved out of grace or out of that state of surrender and trust and into our false control, our despotic leader kind of energy, then we limit the damage that we cause to ourselves and others. And it's a lovely state to live in. The ultimate emotional state for me is the idea of contentment, and contentment as a state of bliss or deep joy, that we're not seeking these highs constantly, and that we're able to sit in that place of absolute peace where we are never doubting God, even if we don't know where the path is leading us. When things become uncertain, this is when we're going to have to be particularly vigilant to notice if we've moved into false control. So that's what I wanted to share today, and I'm deeply grateful for you hanging out with me. This is not introductory knowledge. This is something that I think those of you who've been walking the path for a while and understand the machinations of the saboteur archetype and the way that we can derail ourselves when we're actually moving beautifully in the direction that we're meant to move. This is big stuff for us to wrap our heads around. And in order for us to move forward together and to create a new paradigm, we all need to become very vigilant of this, because so much time can be wasted when we don't just continue that forward momentum. So look always to that middle path, that straight and true path, that arrow that is leading you back towards your truth, which is you are infinite, unlimited consciousness. And is this choice simply out of fear that I am out of control and I don't know the outcome and I don't know how I'm going to get there and I don't know what it will look like and I don't know whether everyone I love will get to come with me? Or am I actually in a state of grace, which is surrender and trust combined? Okay, dear beloveds, thank you so much. Please share your thoughts and let me know if you want to hear more about this topic. This is part of the work around spiritual leadership or sacred leadership that's taking more and more of my time. I spent yesterday in the studio recording a new program for Insight Timer called Sacred Leadership, which is about a new paradigm of power. And of course, I have Higher Power, which is an on-demand 4-part program, which introduces the formula in its fullness so that you can really master your path as a sacred leader, because it can feel very overwhelming, as particularly for spiritual women, to feel safe to embody our power. And I believe that my work more and more is about supporting women to be unafraid of their divine power. All my love, dear ones, and I'll see you very soon. Have a beautiful weekend, and please celebrate all of the incredible things that you are and all that you've done this week. Bye.